It was my first time visiting New Orleans. The vibrant energy of the French Quarter pulsed through the streets, a blend of music, laughter, and the scent of Creole spices. I had always been drawn to places steeped in history, and there was one spot I had been dying to see: the infamous Lalaurie Mansion. I'd heard whispers of its dark past, the terrible things that had happened behind those walls, but curiosity got the better of me. That evening, as the sun began to set and cast long shadows over the cobblestone streets, I found myself standing before the iron gates of the mansion. The building was grand, imposing even, with its high walls and tall windows that seemed to peer down at me like watchful eyes. It had an air of elegance, but there was something sinister about it too, a heaviness that pressed against my chest the longer I stood there. The tour guide arrived, an older woman with piercing blue eyes that seemed to know more than she let on. She spoke of the mansion's past, of Madame Delphine Lalaurie, and the gruesome discoveries made after the fire that ravaged the house in 1834. But as she led the group inside, her voice seemed to fade into the background, drowned out by the unsettling silence that filled the mansion's halls. Once inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, though no one else seemed to notice. The walls were adorned with ornate moldings, and chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a dim glow over the dusty furniture. But it wasn't the decor that held my attention. It was the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to seep into my very bones. We walked through the rooms, the guide recounting tales of dinner parties and extravagant balls, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My footsteps echoed loudly as I trailed behind the group, the shadows flickering just out of the corner of my eye. I could almost hear the faint whispers of conversations long past, the laughter of guests mingling with something darker, something sinister. It wasn't until we reached the upper floors that things began to change. As we climbed the creaky staircase, I felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my breath caught in my throat. When we reached the landing, I hesitated. The rest of the group moved on, but I found myself drawn to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the darkness beyond. Against my better judgment, I stepped toward it. As my fingers brushed the doorknob, a cold shiver shot through me, but I pushed the door open anyway. The room beyond was small, cramped, with no furniture save for an old wooden chair in the corner. The walls were stained, discolored as though something had seeped into the plaster. But what caught my attention was the mirror. It was tall, standing against the far wall, its surface dark and clouded with age. I took a step closer, unable to resist the pull it had on me. When I looked into the mirror, I saw something I wasn't expecting. My own reflection, but not quite. My face stared back at me, but my eyes were hollow, black as pitch. The reflection grinned, a sickening, twisted smile that didn't belong to me. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but the image didn't disappear. It remained, staring, grinning, mocking me. Suddenly, a deafening scream echoed through the mansion, tearing through the silence like a knife. It wasn't part of the tour. This scream was raw, filled with agony and desperation. My reflection vanished, and in its place I saw something far worse. A figure stood behind me in the mirror. A woman, her skin pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. She was dressed in rags, her face twisted in a grimace of pain. Blood trickled down her arms, staining the floor beneath her. I spun around, but the room was empty, yet the sense of her presence lingered, thick in the air. I bolted out of the room, my heart racing, and nearly collided with the guide. She frowned at me, her eyes narrowing as if she knew what I had seen but chose not to say anything. I didn't mention the woman in the mirror. I couldn't. The rest of the tour was a blur. My mind fixated on the vision I'd seen and the scream that still echoed in my ears. When the tour ended, I left the mansion, but the weight of what I had experienced clung to me. As I walked back through the dimly lit streets of the French Quarter, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow seemed to move. Every whisper seemed directed at me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the woman from the mirror standing in the street. But there was nothing. Nothing but the cold night air and the faint sound of footsteps that didn't belong to me. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the stories of the Lalaurie Mansion had gotten under my skin. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. Something had followed me out of that house, something that wasn't ready to let go. The nightmares began that very night. I had barely fallen asleep when they took hold, dragging me into a dark and twisted version of the mansion. In my dream, I was back inside those cold, decaying walls, but this time there was no tour guide, no group of tourists to ground me in reality. The house was empty, silent except for the sound of my own breath, which seemed far too loud in the oppressive stillness. I wandered through the halls, my footsteps echoing like the ticking of a clock counting down to something terrible. The air was thick with the scent of burning flesh, and the walls seemed to pulse as though they were alive. breathing, watching me. Every door I passed was slightly ajar, and behind each one I could sense something lurking, waiting for me to open it. But I didn't. I couldn't! The fear was too strong, an icy grip around my throat that tightened with every step I took. Finally, I found myself at the foot of the grand staircase, the same one from the tour. But now it was twisted, warped, like something out of a nightmare. The steps seemed to stretch on forever, spiraling upward into darkness. And at the top, just barely visible in the shadows, was her. The woman from the mirror. Her hollow eyes bore into me, and though she didn't move, I could feel her pulling me toward her, dragging me up the stairs with an invisible force. I tried to resist, to turn and run, but my legs moved of their own accord. Step by step I ascended, my heart pounding louder with each one. The air grew colder, the stench of burning flesh stronger, and with every step, I could hear the faint sound of whispers. Voices pleading, begging for help. When I reached the top, she was gone. But I knew she was still there, hiding in the shadows, watching. The door before me creaked open on its own, revealing a room that was both familiar and horrifying. It was the same room I had entered during the tour, with the mirror and the wooden chair. But now the mirror was shattered, and the chair was occupied. A man sat in it, slumped forward, his wrists bound to the arms of the chair with iron chains. His clothes were torn and bloodied, his skin covered in burns and bruises. His head hung low, and for a moment I thought he was dead. But then he raised his head slowly and looked at me. His eyes were filled with unspeakable pain, and his lips moved as if trying to form words. But all that came out was a hoarse, ragged breath. I wanted to help him, to free him from the chains that bound him. But when I took a step forward, the floor beneath me groaned, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The man's eyes widened in terror, and he mouthed something I couldn't hear but understood all too well. "Run!" Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath now, white puffs of air in the freezing cold. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams, agonized, tortured screams that echoed off the walls and reverberated through my skull. And then, she was there, standing behind the man in the chair, Madame Delphine Lalaurie. Her once beautiful face was now twisted into a grotesque mask of cruelty and malice. Her dress, elegant and pristine in life, was now stained with blood and soot. She reached out with one pale, bony hand and placed it on the man's shoulder. He flinched at her touch, his body trembling with fear. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away. But I was frozen in place, trapped in the nightmare with no way out. Lalaurie turned her gaze toward me, her lips curling into a wicked smile. She leaned down, whispering something in the man's ear, and as she did, his body began to convulse, shaking violently against the chains that held him. His screams joined the others, a symphony of suffering that filled the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The room fell silent, the air thick with the stench of death. The man in the chair was motionless, his head slumped forward once more. Lalaurie straightened, her eyes locked on mine, and in that moment, I knew. She wasn't just a ghost, a memory of the past. She was something far worse, something alive, feeding on the agony of those trapped within her house. And now, she had her sights set on me. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. It took me a moment to realize I was back in my hotel room, safe, far away from the mansion. But even as I tried to calm myself, to convince myself that it had only been a dream, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around the room, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The curtains rustled in the breeze, the clock on the nightstand ticked quietly, and for a moment everything seemed normal. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The faint outline of a figure standing in the corner of the room, watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to face it. But when I blinked, it was gone. The room was empty again, but the oppressive feeling remained, weighing down on me like a lead blanket. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak, every rustle of the wind sent a jolt of fear through me. And when the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the curtains, I knew that whatever had followed me out of that mansion wasn't finished with me yet. It had only just begun. The days after my visit to the Lalaurie Mansion were a blur. I tried to resume my normal routine, convincing myself that what I had experienced was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But it was impossible to escape the lingering dread that clung to me like a shadow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, Madame Lalaurie, with that twisted smile and those cold, dead eyes. I decided to cut my trip short and leave New Orleans, but even as I packed my bags and booked an early flight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. In the mirror, in the darkened corners of rooms, in every reflection, I saw movement, fleeting glimpses of figures that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. My sleep was plagued by nightmares, each one more vivid and terrifying than the last. On my final night in the city, exhaustion finally claimed me, and I fell into a restless sleep. But this time the nightmare was different. I wasn't in the mansion. I was back in my hotel room, but everything was wrong. The air was thick with the scent of burning flesh, just like in my dreams of the mansion, and the walls seemed to pulse as though they were alive. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. Suddenly a loud knock echoed through the room. I jolted upright, my heart racing. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. It was coming from the door to my room. I hesitated, fear gripping me as I stared at the door. There was no peephole, no way to see who or what was on the other side. The knock came again, followed by a low, raspy voice. "Let me in," it whispered, barely more than a breath but filled with menace. "You can't escape me." I backed away from the door, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. I could feel the presence of someone, behind that door, and every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of that room before it was too late. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, my legs rooted to the spot. The door rattled violently, the knocking turning into pounding as if something was trying to break it down. "Let me in!" The voice hissed, more insistent now, filled with rage. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me, each exhale forming a white cloud that quickly dissipated. And then the pounding stopped. Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. I stood frozen, waiting for whatever was on the other side of the door to make its next move. Seconds stretched into minutes, but nothing happened. Just as I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over, a soft creaking sound broke the silence. The door slowly, agonizingly began to open on its own. I wanted to scream, to bolt for the window and escape, but I couldn't move. I could only watch in horror as the door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. For a brief moment the room was deathly quiet. Then out of the shadows, she stepped forward. Madame Lalaurie. Her gaunt figure was even more terrifying in the dim light, her skin pale and ashen, her eyes black pits of emptiness. She moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the floor toward me without making a sound. Her lips curled into that same twisted smile, and I could see the malice in her eyes, the hunger. She was here for me. I stumbled back, my body finally breaking free of the paralysis, but it was too late. She was inches away from me now, her cold breath on my skin, her skeletal fingers reaching out to touch me. As her hand brushed against my arm, a searing pain shot through me, and I screamed, falling to the floor. The room seemed to warp and shift around me, the walls closing in, the ceiling lowering. The floorboards creaked and groaned as though the entire building was alive, a living, breathing entity that was swallowing me whole. I crawled backward, desperate to get away from her, but no matter how far I moved, she was always just behind me, her shadow stretching over me like a shroud. And then she spoke, her voice a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. "You cannot escape what you have seen. You belong to me now." I tried to fight, to push her away, but her grip was like iron, cold and unyielding. The room spun around me, the walls warping and distorting until I couldn't tell where I was anymore. All I could see was her face twisted and grotesque, her eyes burning with hatred. Suddenly I was no longer in the hotel room. I was back in the mansion, in that same room with the broken mirror and the chair. But now I wasn't alone. The walls were lined with figures, dozens of them, all gaunt and pale, their eyes hollow, their bodies broken and bloodied. They were the tortured souls of Madame Lalaurie's victims, trapped in this hellish place for eternity. They watched me with dead eyes, their mouths moving in silent pleas for help. But I couldn't help them. I couldn't even help myself. Madame Lalaurie stood in the center of the room, her arms outstretched, welcoming me into her world of torment. And then the screaming began. The tortured souls around me cried out in agony, their voices blending into a deafening chorus of pain. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The screams filled my head, echoing in my mind, tearing at my sanity. I tried to run, but the room seemed to stretch on forever, the door always just out of reach. No matter how fast I moved, it stayed the same distance away, taunting me with the promise of escape that would never come. And then as quickly as it had begun, the screaming stopped. I was alone again, standing in the middle of the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures were gone, vanished as if they had never been there. But the room was different now. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the walls were stained with blood. Fresh, wet blood that dripped down to the floor in thick rivulets. And in the center of the room, where Madame Lalaurie had stood, was a single word, scrawled in blood. Mine. I woke up screaming, my body drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the shadows long and deep, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming, or if I had finally woken up. But then I saw it, the figure standing in the corner, watching me with hollow eyes. She was here. She had followed me, and there was no escape. I didn't leave New Orleans. I couldn't. Every time I tried to leave my hotel, something pulled me back. A force I couldn't fight, no matter how hard I tried. The city's streets, once alive with music and color, now seemed sinister, filled with shadows that watched me with unseen eyes. I knew deep down that I was trapped. For days I stayed inside my room, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to face what awaited me in the dark. But even in the daylight, I couldn't escape her. She was always there, in the corner of my vision, just out of reach but always present. I could feel her cold breath on the back of my neck, hear her whispering my name in the dead of night. The nightmares never stopped. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that room in the mansion, surrounded by the tortured souls of the past. Madame Lalaurie was always there, waiting for me, her twisted smile a constant reminder that there was no escape. But something was changing. The visions were becoming more vivid, more real. I began to hear things, whispers in the walls, footsteps in the hallways, soft scratching at the door. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the sounds grew louder, more insistent, until they were impossible to ignore. One night, as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door, I heard it again. A faint scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door, watching the handle slowly turn. The door creaked open, and for a moment all I saw was darkness. Then she stepped into the room. Madame Lalaurie. Her figure was more solid now, more real. She wasn't just a ghost anymore. She was something else, something alive and dead at the same time. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me, freezing me in place. "You've been chosen," she whispered, her voice a sickening mixture of sweetness and malice. "You will join them." I tried to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. She moved closer, her hand reaching out to touch me, and as her fingers brushed against my skin, a jolt of pain shot through me. It was like being burned alive, but from the inside out. I fell to the floor, writhing in agony as the room around me began to warp and twist. The walls seemed to melt, the floor cracked and split open, revealing a black void beneath me. From the darkness, I could hear the screams of the damned, their voices filled with terror and despair. And then the floor gave way, and I was falling into the abyss. I landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I gasped for breath, my body trembling as I tried to get my bearings. I was in a dark, narrow hallway, the walls damp and slick with moisture. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, and I could hear the distant sound of chains rattling in the darkness. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking as I took a few hesitant steps forward. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, with no end in sight. As I walked, the sounds grew louder. The chains, the whispers, the soft, wet squelching of something moving in the darkness. I turned a corner and froze. Before me was a large iron door, covered in rust and grime. The chains rattled behind it, the sound of something or someone struggling against their restraints. I knew what was behind that door. I knew who was waiting for me on the other side, but I couldn't turn back. I had to face it. With trembling hands, I reached out and pushed the door open. The room beyond was a nightmare come to life. The walls were lined with iron chains, each one attached to a figure, gaunt, bloodied, and broken. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams. They were the souls of Madame Lalaurie's victims, trapped in eternal torment. In the center of the room stood Madame Lalaurie herself, holding a long iron rod in her hand, its tip glowing red-hot. She turned to face me, her eyes burning with hatred. "You belong to me!" she hissed, her voice echoing off the walls. "You will suffer as they have suffered." I tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick with the scent of burning flesh. I could feel the heat from the iron rod, the flames licking at my skin, and I knew that this was the end. But just as she moved to strike, something changed. The figures on the walls began to stir, their chains rattling as they slowly lifted their heads. Their hollow eyes locked onto Madame Lalaurie, and for the first time I saw fear in her gaze. The souls began to pull against their chains, their bodies shaking with the effort. The chains groaned and creaked, and one by one they began to break free. Madame Lalaurie screamed in rage, her voice high and shrill, but the souls were relentless. They surged forward, their broken bodies moving with a terrifying strength, and they descended upon her. I watched in horror as they tore her apart, their hands clawing at her flesh, ripping her to pieces. Her screams echoed through the room, a cacophony of pain and fury, until finally, there was silence. The room grew still, the air heavy with the stench of death. The souls stood motionless, their eyes blank and empty, as though they had finally been freed from their torment. Slowly, one by one, they began to fade, dissolving into the darkness until only I remained. I was alone, standing in the center of the room, surrounded by the remnants of Madame Lalaurie's madness. The iron rod lay on the ground at my feet, still glowing faintly, but the flames had gone out. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in place before I finally found the strength to move. I turned and walked toward the door, my steps slow and heavy. When I reached it, I hesitated for a moment, half expecting it to slam shut again, but it didn't. It swung open easily, and I stepped out into the hallway. The air was different now, lighter, almost peaceful. The stench of decay was gone, replaced by the faint scent of jasmine. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence, until I reached the stairs. When I stepped outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden light over the city. The streets were quiet, the air cool and crisp. I took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of being alive, and for the first time in days, I felt free. But as I turned to walk away from the mansion, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the shadows of the doorway. I stopped, my heart pounding, and slowly turned back to face it. There in the doorway stood Madame Lalaurie. Her body was broken, torn apart by the souls she had tortured, but her eyes, those black, empty eyes, were still filled with rage. She smiled at me, that same twisted smile, and whispered one final word. "Mine." And then she vanished, leaving nothing but the cold wind and the lingering scent of jasmine.